listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, homophobia in the AFL is back in the spotlight, with star Crows player Izak Rankine banned for 4 games for using a slur against a Collingwood opponent. We'll unpack the controversy that's making headlines across the country. But first, let's check what's making news this Thursday, the 21st of August. 2 bodies have been found in a river north of Sydney in the search for a missing father and son. They are yet to be formally identified, but a man aged in his 50s and his 2 sons were in a car when it hit a tree and then plunged into the Macdonald River near Wiseman's Ferry late last night. One son managed to escape and raise the alarm with his brother and father missing. New South Wales has been hit by record-breaking rain this week, with parts of Sydney recording 4 weeks of rain over just 2 days. This month is now the wettest August in almost 30 years. The New South Wales SES responding to 430 incidents over the past 24 hours. Here's the Deputy SES Commissioner, Deb Platts.
As widespread rain and flooding continues to impact many areas of New South Wales, we are urging people to stay ready and stay safe.
A number of weather warnings are now in place with the wet weather system moving towards Queensland. The Commonwealth Bank has reversed its decision to cut 45 jobs, admitting the roles were wrongly axed due to artificial intelligence. CBA apologised to the affected customer service staff after discovering their positions were not redundant, despite the rollout of an AI-powered voice bot. The finance sector union called the back down a major win, saying staff reported workloads had actually increased after the bot was introduced. The employees have now been offered the choice to stay in their roles, seek redeployment or take a redundancy. The reversal comes as the bank posts a record $10.25 billion cash profit for the 2025 financial year. And a federal judge has denied a move by the US administration to release grand jury testimony from the Jeffrey Epstein case. Judge Richard Berman claimed Trump's Justice Department did not provide adequate reasoning to unseal the highly confidential documents. He also labelled the move by the US administration as a diversion. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on the controversy surrounding AFL superstar Izak Rankine. The Crows star player has just been banned for 4 games for a homophobic slur against a Collingwood opponent, but he could still play in the AFL Grand Final if his team makes it. One leading expert says bans don't work, and there is a serious cultural issue within many Australian sports that has a crippling effect on young people across the country. Behavioural expert from Monash University, Erik Denison, joins us to explain what needs to change. And a warning, the content of this interview contains references to suicide and also contains homophobic language. Erik, thanks so much for joining us on this incredibly important topic. We've seen this homophobic language back in the media spotlight. What are your feelings about what's going on right now?
They're really mixed right now because on one hand, I'm watching this closely because at least in the AFL, we've never had this kind of drama go on around this language in terms of we're right before final season. This is the team at the top of the ladder. This is their star player, and he may or may not play as part of the finals. And that's all drama for the last week they've been talking about that now seems to be resolved finally. But, it doesn't really matter in terms of the ban. That's the problem, is that we know that these bans don't seem to trickle down to where this problem starts. So we started research on this topic, specifically on how much homophobic language is being used by young AFL players, and why are they using this language about 10 years ago. And so that research would have been with Izak's cohort, essentially, as they're coming up through the system, right? Because he's 25. We were surveying 16, 17-year-olds kind of thing. So his group. And when we did that research, we found around half of them self-report, say, yes, I use homophobic language regularly. And we asked them, like, in the past 2 weeks, how often have you heard your teammates use words like, FAG, puff, homo, those kinds of things. And then we asked them, and how many times have you used language like this? We don't call it homophobic. We just ask them words like this. And when we ask them that, that's where we find about half of them have used the language, and about 70% of them have heard others use the language. So this language is rife. We know that. There's this idea that this is a one-off event. It's a rare thing. It was a slip of the tongue in the heat of the moment, all of that sort of narrative that goes on within the sport media. We know that's just not true. This language is used day to day, primarily in the sheds. But the motivation is what we're really interested in, because when we learn about the motivation, that's when we can learn how to change this behavior. And it's not just homophobic language we're interested in. Often homophobic and sexist language is used interchangeably, and they have the same motivations in terms of why they're used from the research that we and others have conducted.
So, Erik, fascinating point you make there about where this comes from. Expand that, because it's a really interesting point you make. It's not just homophobic language, it's also sexist language that seems to be completely normalized.
Yeah, so we've conducted quite a few studies. So I've personally, my research has involved over 20,000 participants around the world in different countries. And a lot of my research, because I'm a behavioral scientist. And so my research is focused on how common is this language and why is it used, with the focus on trying to stop this behavior. And it's probably, before we continue on sort of like the why is it used question, it's probably really important to help your listeners understand why it's so harmful, like why Monash University and other big universities are investing so heavily in trying to solve this behavior. Because you think, oh, it's just sticks and stones, a bit of banter, a few gay kids get hurt, but that's it. Well, that's not the case at all. Of course, it's detrimental to gay kids. Of course, this language is. Like it deters them from playing sport. And we know gay kids play sport at about half the rate of straight kids, straight boys and gay boys. And bi boys are sort of in the middle there. So it's definitely harmful to them. But what the research shows is that this language is generally used as an insult to attack a boy's identity as a man. So it's not that he is attack them because they're gay. It's not saying you're gay. That's just part of the attack of their masculinity. So it's to attack a boy's identity sort of globally. And that's why really solid research that's come out of medical journals in the United States has found boys who are exposed to homophobic language, who are bullied with homophobic language, whether they're gay or whether they're straight, it increases their risk of suicide and self-harm. So then we go to okay, so why are they using this language? Well, because it's primarily motivated by this desire to fit in, to perform a form of masculinity that is sort of, we think, is gone out of fashion. But in these environments, in large part because the coaches are keeping this kind of masculinity in fashion. So if you want the favor of the coach, who's generally, 40 or 50 years old, you've got to perform this kind of masculinity, right? So they perform it, and they use this language on a regular basis to really attack each other's identity in some cases, as we see in the AFL during games. But more often than not, it's used in the sheds as part of jokes and banter, and as sort of say, hey, I'm straight, I'm a real man, and making those subtle jokes of like, oh, you must be gay. And particularly they get really uncomfortable showering around each other or changing around each other. So that's where we see this language used more than any other setting, is when they're in the changing room, the sheds, changing in front of each other. That's when these jokes start, because it's sort of like, hey, you're okay. I'm not going to stare at you while you're changing because, I'm not gay. I'm going to make jokes about gay people. Now, the other serious consequence then is because this permeates the entire sport environment, right? It's basically the wallpaper in these sporting environments. Boys perceive it to be like, well, this environment is homophobic because the language is so common. And here's where the really serious issue or consequence of this language emerges, is that if a boy is being sexually abused by a coach, the Royal Commission on Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse found that boy is much less likely to report that abuse in an environment where this language is used regularly, because they don't want to be perceived as gay. They don't want to be perceived as having invited this abuse. And so they won't report it. And then that perpetration continues. As we know, abusers generally perpetrate with multiple victims over time, right? Until potentially one of them reports it. But boys don't report it because there's this stigma still around being gay. And it's reinforced daily, constantly by this language. But the irony is they're not using this language with the specific intent to express hate about gay people.
So, Erik, in this specific case we're talking about now, because it's back in the spotlight, you believe it doesn't really matter what ban Izak Rankine faces, whether that's a 3-week ban, whether that's a 5-week ban, whether this star player is allowed to play for his team, which is important to note. He is a star player and their team is top of the AFL table right now. Why do you believe it doesn't matter what type of ban he gets?
Well, that's why this one's quite interesting, because it is that whole drama around it, whereas other players get the bans and there's not this sort of wall-to-wall media coverage. I saw one commentator say, he clearly used the language. What's the question here, right? Well, it took a shorter time to pick the last pope than it has for the AFL to go through this process, right? In terms of the time it takes. Someone else cynically said, are they maybe doing this on purpose to generate press about the finals coming up and, get attention? I don't think that's true, but, cynics, are saying this and it feels like that, right? Like, why has this been dragged out? So that makes it a bit unique, and that you wonder if the message is going to get down to the grassroots. But the problem is these boys aren't using this language consciously. They're not thinking in their head, I'm going to use the word FAG ever. In fact, when we do research with them, and one of the most effective ways to stop this behavior is actually getting teams to participate in pride games, because then the entire team is involved in the process. It changes those norms of masculinity on the team, right? Suddenly they realize, oh, everyone else isn't the jerk I thought they were. And it challenges the coach who's maintaining this old school masculinity in there. And it just changes the norms on the team, it seems. But we consistently heard that players would use homophobic language during a pride game, and it would come out of their mouth, and they would, for the first time, notice they were actually saying these words, right? That was the first time, because they're wearing rainbow. They've just talked about it. They're doing it as a team. They're like, oh my gosh. And the common thing was it was like swearing in front of my grandmother. When you do that and you're like, oh, I just swore in front of my grandmother, and it hits you and you're like, and you probably won't do it again. You maybe would once or twice, but you realize the language coming in your mouth. And so that's where doing a ban like this, it doesn't really have an impact to the grassroots, because it leads to more people calling out this language, right? So particularly if it leads to like captains and coaches calling out this language, that's where we'll see change. But we've tested interventions where we've educated boys. We brought in professional athletes to talk to the boys about this language for half an hour. And that didn't stop the language, right? Because it's not a conscious behavior. So that's where these bans don't seem to work at the grassroots. What we really need is for things like pride games to be adopted by all clubs. And, mentioned, sexist language is often used interchangeably with these words. And so another really important one that rugby's developed is like respect woman rounds, or just respect rounds, where it's about respect, particularly, or celebrating women rounds, right? And so those give an opportunity where captains in particular can have conversations with their team about this topic, but it's not really even the conversation that shifts things. It's just participating as a group in something about changing a behavior. And then people start calling each other out. They feel safe to say, hey, don't use that language. That's what changes things, right? When the group decides to change its behavior, which is because the norms and sort of values have changed, that's when behavior changes. But these sort of external factors, bringing in a trainer or putting a poster up or fining a player or, giving them a suspension, those are all outside of this club environment, and they don't change the norms of the environment necessarily, And so that's what we need to focus on. This is normative behavior. This is cultural behavior. It's deeply rooted cultural behavior in sport. And that means we need to change the norms of culture. We don't need to change the brains of the kids. We need to change their environment, if that makes sense.
And actions always speak louder than words. We appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much, Erik.
Thank you very much.
That was behavioural scientist Erik Denison from the Faculty of Arts at Monash University. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. And we'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.